the table, and I'll record them so that I can give it to them when I see them this week.
Fantastic.
So some of us have said about time.
Yes.
Praise God. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice."
Yeah.
And that's how it's supposed to be. We're his sheep, we're his followers, and we are supposed to be hearing his voice. We're supposed to be listening to him. But it doesn't happen automatically. If we're going to hear his voice, then we need to be listening for his voice. And that means that we need to stop listening to some of the other voices that we listen to.
Yep.
And so today I just want to have a look at some of those other voices that all too often as Christians we listen to and get distracted from hearing the voice of the Lord. And the first one, probably the most obvious, is the voice of temptation. We all know the story of the fall of man. God created Adam and Eve, placed them in a perfect garden, created them to be like him in every way that they could. And he said to them, you're free to look after the garden, you're free to eat anything from the garden except the fruit from that one tree.
Yep.
And then the devil came along in the form of a serpent and came to Eve and said, well, first of all, he said, did God really say that? Did God really say you can't eat anything from the garden? And that's the first thing that the voice of temptation will do, is it will exaggerate what God's asked him. And when she said, no, well, we can eat anything except the fruit of that tree, then the devil said, well, you know why God says you can't eat that one, don't you? It's because that one will make you wise. You'll be like God yourself. Now, they were already like God, but he was saying you'll be as gods. You'll be able to run your own lives. Yeah. Voice of temptation will always question what God says. And it will always suggest that what God says is wrong is actually right. And it's not only right, but it's something that's good for you. And you really should try it. And, it's not so blatant with us as it was with Adam and Eve. We don't have a talking serpent come up to us and whisper in our ears. But that voice of temptation is still there in so many ways. Now, God has set down principles of what's right and wrong. He's set down principles of how people should live, and particularly how his people should live. But that voice of temptation comes along and says, God's just being a narc when he says that. Yeah. God says that's wrong. No, that's not wrong. That's not wrong. If you say that's wrong, then you're wrong. Have you heard that? So many times in our world, where the very thing that God says is wrong is turned around to be right.
Yeah.
And if you continue saying that it's wrong, then you're the one that's wrong.
Yep.
But God knew that was going to happen. He says in his word, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. He knew that it was going to happen. He knew that voice of temptation was going to be there. He knew that voice was going to be there that would mock God and everything that he says, would turn what is right into what is wrong, and turn what is wrong into what is right. But we don't have to listen to that voice. And sometimes it's very subtle. It's not blatant and in your face like that. It's just that subtle thought that's intruded into your mind. Did God really say that? God God, a good God wouldn't say that, surely. We need to recognise that voice of temptation and to stand against it. How do we recognise it? By recognising what God said in the first place. If Eve had had a stronger hold on what God actually said, she would have had a greater ability to stand against what the devil was saying. Because you see, God said you don't eat of that tree. But when Eve responded to the devil, she said, oh, God said you can't even touch it or you'll die. No, God didn't say that. He said don't eat it. We need to know what God actually says so that we can resist that voice of temptation that would distort and accuse what God when he says. The second voice that we need to stop listening to is the voice of popular opinion. When Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt and they came to the mountain and God was manifesting his presence on the mountain, and lightning and fire and the mountain shaking, and the people looked at this and they said, Moses, we're not going up there. You go up there. We're not going up there, we might die. So Moses went up to receive from God his directions for the people. He'd been up there for about 6 weeks. And the people down the bottom are getting restless. And they come to Aaron, Moses' brother, who's down there with them. And they say, this bloke Moses, he's been up there for nearly 6 weeks. We don't know what's happened to him. He's probably dead. We need you to make us some gods to lead us. Now, Aaron should have known better. But he was the guy who had been Moses' spokesman. Now, back up when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and said to go back to Egypt and set the people free. And Moses had said, no, I can't talk to Pharaoh. I can't do that. And God, as a concession to him, said, okay, here's your brother Aaron. He'll be your spokesman. So whatever Moses spoke to Aaron, Aaron then spoke to Pharaoh and the people. Aaron had been there through all the plagues. He'd been there through all the discussion with Pharaoh. He'd been there at the Red Sea when they got there. There's the sea in front of them and the army of Egypt behind them. And Moses said, what do I do? And God said, lift up your staff, and he did. And the waters parted and they went through. And Aaron was there. He knew the power of God. He had no excuses. He knew that the Lord, that Yahweh, was the true God. But these people came to him. The voice of popular opinion. We need gods to lead us. What they wanted was gods that they could control. Gods that weren't going to make any demands upon them. And the voice of popular opinion will always look for the easy way. The voice of popular opinion will always look for gods that ask nothing. Popular opinion is quite happy to acknowledge that there's a God as long as he sits up in heaven and does his own thing up there and doesn't bother us, thank you very much. And that's the voice that so much of the church, unfortunately, has listened to. So much of the church wants to look like the world, wants to go with the popular opinion, rather than going with the reality of who God is and what He wants. Church, we need to stop. We need to stop listening to that voice of popular opinion. We need to stop listening to what the world thinks is a good thing and start listening to what God says is a good thing.
Yeah.
I've said it before, and I'll probably say it many times again. The world doesn't need a copy of itself. It doesn't need a church that looks like it. All the things that the world does, it doesn't need us to imitate them. It needs to see a church that is radically different.
Amen.
It needs to see a church that reflects the character of God, not the one that reflects the popular opinion. Another voice that we need to stop listening to is the voice of peer pressure. After King Solomon died, now King Solomon is an interesting character. He started his reign with enormous wisdom. When he came into the throne after his father died, the first thing he did was pray and said, Lord, give me wisdom to be able to lead this people of yours. And God said, because you've asked for wisdom, I will give you other blessings as well, the wealth of life and all the rest of it. But as he progressed, this incredibly wise man, Solomon, proved that in one area, the area of women, he was a total fool. He ended up marrying 700 women and had another 300 concubines. The mind boggles. And all of them were foreigners. And all of them brought their worship of their gods into the palace. And so this man who had started out in great wisdom ended up following all these false gods. And because of that, God said, after you, I am going to split the kingdom. And when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was to come into the kingdom. And the people came to Rehoboam. And they said to him, you know, your father put a heavy load on us. He demanded taxes. He demanded people to work on his building projects. Lighten the load. Make it a bit easier for you people. And Rehoboam said, well, let me think about that a bit. And so he called for the elders of the country and said, well, how should I answer these people? And the elders very wisely said, give them what they're asking for. Make life easier for them and they will follow you. But Rehoboam said, well, I want a second opinion. And so he went and talked to his young mates. And these guys, typical young blokes, full of testosterone, full of bravado, full of I'm the man. They said, no, don't give in to them. You tell them my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. Somehow they thought this was going to endear people to him. But Rehoboam chose to follow the advice of his mates. Now, I did actually hear a young male preacher one time who thought that the advice of the mates was good advice, just in case anybody's thinking along those lines. If you read along a little bit further in the story, God describes them as reckless and arrogant, I think is the word that God uses. God didn't see it as good advice. God used it because as a result of that, 10 of the tribes said, well, we're not going to follow you, we'll go off and follow this other fellow, Jeroboam. So God used even the bad advice to achieve what he wanted. But I'm sure his preference would have been for Rehoboam to follow the wise advice of the elders and to prove that he was going to be a good king so that God didn't need to split the kingdom. The voice of peer pressure is always about ego. It's always about looking good with your mates. It's always about fitting in. And that can be hard. Particularly for young people, it can be hard because they want to belong. They want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. And that something is the group that they're running with. But it's not just young people that are affected by peer pressure. Us oldies can be too. We need to learn to not listen to the voice of peer pressure, not listen to those voices that would try to make us important in our own sort of thinking. You know, it may well be that God has great things for your life. In fact, I believe that God has great things for everybody's life, far greater than we can imagine. But those great things will be for the sake of the kingdom, not for the sake of your ego. Those great things will be to build God's kingdom, not to build your kingdom. We need to stop listening to the voice of peer pressure. We need to stop listening to the voice of the occult. And this is a very big one in the world today and even in the church today, unfortunately. You remember in the book of Acts, Paul came into the town in one place, and there's this little girl, this lady kept following him and the team and kept shouting out, "These men are here from the Most High God. They're here to tell you how to be saved." Sounds good, doesn't it? It was absolutely correct. They were there from the Most High God, and they were there to tell people how to be saved. But what was wrong with it? It was coming from a wrong spirit. And Paul, praise God, had enough discernment to see the spirit that was behind it and to cast that spirit out of that woman who had that spirit that had her bound up. The thing about the voice of the occult is it sounds so much like the real thing. And that's what counterfeit is. It's something that's like the real thing. You don't make a counterfeit $100 note and make it bright pink with Mickey Mouse's face on it. You make it look like a real $100 note. And it disturbs me greatly that the church is so unaware of the influence of the occult. So much I see that is passed off as Christianity, and really it's an occult influence coming through, a New Age influence coming through. Because all the New Age is the old occultism in fancy dress. So much of what I see posted on Facebook that claims to be Christian, but underneath you can see this spirit that's a New Age spirit coming through. What is the difference? The difference is that occultism or New Ageism tries to establish a spiritual reality without God. It tries to get back to the Garden of Eden without the God of Eden. It seeks to draw on spiritual forces that are not from the Lord. And Christians dabble in it. We need the gift of discernment of spirits. We need to learn to tell the difference between the voice of the Lord and the voice of the occult. We need to put aside those things and focus on God. Allow God to draw us, not these other things. Perhaps tying in a little to that, we need to stop listening to the voice of wrong prophecy. Now, before I go on to this, let me say categorically, I believe in prophecy. I move in prophecy. Prophecy is real. It's an important gift for the church today. But not everything that has "thus says the Lord" tacked in front of it is actually from God. There's a story in 1 Kings chapter 13. Some time down the track, after Jeroboam had taken control of the northern kingdom, and he was a bad king. He brought in all sorts of bad stuff, of worship of idols, and set up false altars for people to worship so they didn't have to go to Jerusalem, and all this stuff. And this prophet, who is not named, came into town. And he came to one of the elders and pronounced God's judgment against it. And said, this altar is going to be destroyed. And when he was about to go back out of town, another prophet came to meet him. And he said to the first guy, "Come home and eat and drink with my place." And the first prophet said, "No, I can't do that. God told me I was to come and to speak against this altar. I was to come into town in one direction and to leave in a different direction, and I was not to eat or drink while I'm here." Pretty clear directions. And the second prophet said, "Oh, well, I'm also a prophet, and God spoke to me and said to bring you home to eat and drink." And the first guy went. As a result, he got killed. In the middle of the meal, the prophet who had invited him home had a true word from the Lord and said, "You have disobeyed me. When you leave here, a lion is going to attack you and kill you." And that's exactly what happened. Pretty high price to pay for listening to the wrong prophet. In the Old Testament, prophecy took a predominant place because the people themselves didn't have the Holy Spirit living within them. They didn't have access to hear the voice of God for themselves. So they had to hear through the prophet. For us, we have the Spirit of God within us. We're supposed to be listening to Him first of all. Yes, prophecy is important. It's a valuable gift. But if prophecy is replacing your hearing from the Spirit of God who lives within you, then what you are doing is not seeking prophecy, but seeking spiritual Christian fortune telling. You know, I might tread on some toes here. What else is new? I really have a problem with prophets who come in and prophesy over every person in the room. I sit there and I think what God probably wants to say to 90% of the people here is stop seeking a word from the prophet and start listening to me yourself. The role of the prophet should be to confirm what God has already spoken to your heart, or to rebuke you if you're not doing what God tells you or has told you to do. It should not be to give you the word that you are not seeking for yourself. We need to hear from the Spirit of God. And if we've heard from the Spirit of God, we need to be confident enough of it that if somebody else comes along and tells us something different, we say, well, that's not what God said to me. I've heard of cases where generally a bloke will come to a woman and say, God told me not to marry you. Well, you know what? If he hasn't said it to her, then she shouldn't be doing it. It comes back to this hearing God for ourselves. Before the final verse of voice that I want to talk about that we should stop listening to is the voice of false teaching. And again, this can flow into the same area. It's a problem that Paul had even right back in the early church. Now, Paul had this fantastic revelation that the work of Jesus on the cross changed everything. This revelation that even the Jewish people who had been under the law of Moses were no longer under the law of Moses, but under, as Paul writes, the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus. The dynamic was different. He told them it's by grace, not by obeying the law, by grace that you're saved. That doesn't mean that we don't obey God's moral standards. That doesn't mean we throw out God's standards. It means that those standards come from a different source. But right back at the beginning, there were people who started saying, oh, well, that's all very nice, but these Gentiles that are coming in, they've got to obey the law of Moses. You have to follow the Sabbath. You have to do this, you have to do that. And Paul, I can imagine Paul just about tearing his hair out over these guys. He writes to the church at Galatia and says, you foolish Galatians. In one version it says, you idiots of Galatia. Having started with the Spirit, you're now going on with the flesh. You're listening to the wrong teachers. And again, just as not everything that has thus says the Lord in front of it is actually a word from the Lord, not every preacher that gets on YouTube or Facebook or some other platform and teaches, inverted commas, is actually teaching the Word of God. We need to get into the Word for ourselves to be able to know whether that voice that we're hearing, that voice of teaching is actually true to the Word of God, or whether it's somebody's opinions. And believe me, I've had some weird stuff taught. People have strangest ideas. And when you take it back to the Bible, it just does not add up at all. We need to get into the Word for ourselves. We need to get into prayer for ourselves. If we're going to hear the voice of the Lord, if we're going to shut out all these other voices that would claim our attention, then we have to get to know him. We get to know him through his word, and we get to know him through prayer. You want to know what God sounds like? Read the word. Not just the little bits of the word that you like, those few favourite verses that you cling to. We all have them. But the whole of the word. Because only by reading the whole of the word do you get to hear God in all his various, I was going to say moods, but we can't really apply the word moods to God, but all his various aspects. You get to hear what he sounds like when he's joyful, when he's delighting in his people, when he's angry, when he's just fed up with everybody. You know, if we only focus on those few favourite verses, we miss that. It's like having a friend that you only know when he's happy. You've never seen him sad or frightened or worried or anxious. And God doesn't get frightened or worried or anxious, but he does have different aspects of his character. And we need to be able to see him in all of those aspects. So we need to get into the Word. We need to spend time in prayer. We need to spend time not only talking to him, not only running through our list of, Lord, please do this, please do this, please do this, but listening, saying, Lord, speak to me. Speak to me about this situation that I'm facing. Give me your wisdom. Give me your understanding. How do I respond to this? We need to become people who hear his voice and who close our ears to all those other voices.